Okay, so what we're going to do now is get some quick feedback from the 5 groups and then have a discussion. Now the feedback from the groups, I think in view of the time, we had better focus predominantly on the 3 actions, priorities, whatever that you came up with. So I'd ask whoever's presenting in those groups, perhaps the 5 presenters, to save time, can you all come down here? And then we'll just sort of have one after the other. So if I could ask you really to focus, because we don't have much time at all, and I'm sure people have planes and trains and things to catch. So, Alice, do you want to go first?
Yeah, well, I had the...
Here, Alice.
Oh, sorry. I've got an outward. I had the where to next, and we came up with 3, but I think there was a whole lot of others that people wanted to put on there, mostly debating whether we should have had 4 or 5 or 6, but that's okay. We've ended up sort of coming up with, in general agreement, that the Right to Food Coalition needs to continue. We need to sort of look at the resource base, and we need to look at how we can, what was that word? Look at more key stakeholders. The other thing that we felt we needed to was compile, build, contribute, disseminate, more of an add to the evidence base around food security. And we also sort of felt that we needed to be clear about what our key messages were in terms of food insecurity. I think that pretty much covers it. I don't think there was any other burning one. Was there anybody? Just really quickly? No? Great. Okay, good. Write that down. Tools to measure.
Okay, good. All right, Leah? Caitlin, sorry. Caitlin, you want to go next?
Identity crisis. Yep.
Just said Caitlin as well a minute ago, sorry.
So we reflected and came up with our 3 action points, which were firstly that we wanted to look at getting a collection of stories inspired by what Karen presented on yesterday to use as case studies for advocacy. So looking at the kind of impact of education, housing, and how all these things influence our food security. The second action point that we looked at was advocating to all 3 levels of government to encourage them to implement recommendations from the WHO Social Determinants of Health report, but also to emphasise not just to do it, but when they will actually get that done. And we talked about creating a campaign around that. Go on, add to it.
Not the WHO report, the Social Determinants of Health Alliance.
Yes, sorry. Based on, yeah, okay. And the final one was for this time next year, to join in the Anti-Poverty Week campaign and to look at that as a timely opportunity to take action.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yep.
You stay there, that should be
Okay. Oh, no, I don't. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So my group got together to talk about the charitable food sector. So that's any organisation that's providing free or subsidised food to a vulnerable person in Australia. And we had 3 key areas for change that we thought could be realised by this sector. So the first key area was around principles for the organisations that work in this space. So these principles need to be kind of crafted and worded well, but the sorts of things that they could look at would be around nutrition, health, safety and the quality of the food that is provided to vulnerable people, the social justice and the fairness in this space, the dignity and choice of clients or consumers, and the cultural and social, the social appropriateness of the food supply and the charitable food sector. So there'd be a principles and mandate for those organisations in the space. The second key area for change was a best practice tool or framework. So really building on the great programs and the strengths that have already been identified in this space. We understand that in a lot of ways we are doing better than what's happening in the UK or perhaps in America, as we've heard. So it's about building the kind of how-to frameworks and skill sets and systems for food pantries and community kitchens so that they're most effectively using their limited resources. And third and finally, it was around kind of getting the message out there. And this could take the form of collecting data about what is happening in this space and collating it and getting it out there through the media, through coalitions, and advocating for more kind of preventative work so that these organisations see themselves as a part of a wellness agenda and a fight against food insecurity instead of organisations that are prioritising moving food from A to B.
Good, thank you. Now I might leave who's not here till last. So, Danny, do you want to go next?
Okay, so ours was the local government area. Okay, so our three priorities were to look at taking action on the social determinants of health. So there's been agreement, but there's no action. So what? Is this working? Is this one?
Good.
Okay. So what we had came up with was that each of the attendees of the conference commit to leaving the conference and advocating to their local state and federal MPs to take action on food insecurity in the context of the social determinants of health. The second point was capitalising on the upcoming state election in March and presenting to the state government a model state plan and have a peak body to drive campaign to the state MPs and get them to commit to that. And on top of that, also committing funding to implement a state food plan. And then lastly, institutionalising into local government planning policy. So all local governments have an integrated planning reporting framework, or is that framework, making sure that we incorporate into those planning areas so that local government actually commits to addressing food security at a local level.
Thank you. And then who's not here, Liz?
Yes, we addressed the question of, well, who didn't come to the party, whether this was actually either at this function or more broadly in the food security space. The first point, the bullet point we've come up with is engagement. We identified a long list of missing people, including planners, farmers, food growers, food manufacturers, policymakers, politicians, councillors, mental health professionals, dietitians, teachers, educators, and economists. But when we bunched that all together, we basically said that who's not at the party, everyone should be here, but the real challenge is for those that aren't here is not just to identify them, but is also to ensure that they are clear why they should be part of this conversation. And that may be the planners and mental health people, for example. So the second major bullet point we came up with was the environment, and under that we've only touched on it, I think, in a couple of presentations about the environment in which we grow our food. We can't have any food without it. We must be stewards of the environment. That means looking after planning, community development, and looking after farmers. And this came up late in our discussion, and I've called this one the ghost ships, and it could be any number of people, but one of the people in our group said, in her experience, there's this sort of bulge of the middle-class youth who we just assume are doing things fine. We assume that they're learning to cook at home, but a lot of them, they have both parents working in jobs that occupy long hours, and they're not spoken about. And if you actually think about it, this cohort are going to be the next generation of policy makers and politicians, and if they don't have a clue what we're talking about, well, there's not much hope for us. So.
Thank you. Well, thank you to the five presenters. I must say you're extremely succinct.